Justice, in its purest form, isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about courage, integrity, and a refusal to be intimidated by power, position, or influence. When a man like Chief Mancuso walks into a courtroom, he isn't just a defendant. He represents an entire institution, one built on trust, responsibility, and the public's faith that those who wield authority will do so with honor. But when that authority becomes corrupted, when the badge becomes a weapon rather than a shield, justice must step forward, not quietly, not hesitantly, but with absolute certainty. In that courtroom, on that November morning, the law was not merely a concept. It became a living boundary, a wall that Mancuso tried to climb with arrogance, threats, and entitlement, only to be brought back down by accountability. For over 40 years, Judge Caprio served on the bench, dealing with people from every corner of society. The frightened, the guilty, the confused, the reckless, and the repentant. But rarely does a judge face someone who believes they are above the bench itself, untouchable, insulated by rank, political power, secret files, and years of unchecked influence. Mancuso didn't simply break rules. He believed he authored them. That belief is far more dangerous than any single act of corruption, because it poisons the very system meant to protect citizens. When he dismissed subpoenas, ignored federal orders, tampered with evidence, and threatened the court, he wasn't just violating law. He was attempting to rewrite the concept of justice to suit his personal empire. What made this moment monumental wasn't just the arrest. It was a principle that no uniform, no badge, no connections, and no history of service can wash away the stain of abuse. A police chief is supposed to be the example, the standard to which every officer looks. Yet here he was, undermining the very oath he once swore. True justice does not bow because someone claims power, and it certainly does not freeze when someone threatens retaliation. The courtroom that day became a defining moment where law stopped being paper and became presence, where witnesses saw that even the most decorated official must answer to the same system that ordinary citizens do. The arrest was dramatic, yes, but the meaning was far greater than the spectacle. When federal agents stepped forward, when those hidden microphones and cameras revealed months of investigation, it wasn't simply about catching corrupt man. It was about purifying system. Officers like Santos and Torres, good people who carried their badge with pride but lived in silence under intimidation, finally saw daylight breaking through years of shadow. Justice didn't just punish Mancuso. It freed the honorable from his grip. It restored dignity to a department that feared its own leadership. It told every citizen that the courtroom is still a sanctuary where truth outweighs authority. When power is used honorably, it creates safety, trust, and respect. But when power becomes ego, entitlement, and coercion, justice must cut it down for the sake of everyone who still believes in the system. Judge Caprio didn't just enforce a statute. He defended democracy's foundational promise that the law belongs to people, not to the powerful individuals who manipulate it. Mancuso thought he ran the city. He discovered that the Constitution runs a nation, and no badge exists above it. That moment was not just about punishment. It was a restoration of a principle. In true justice, humility is power, and corruption always meets its reckoning. Power, when granted, is not simply a privilege. It is a test. Some pass by serving quietly, fairly, and responsibly. Others, like Chief Mancuso, transform authority into a personal empire, mistaking fear for respect and silence for loyalty. For years, he operated under the belief that rank was a shield and that his uniform could erase every violation, every threat, every illegal favor arranged behind office doors. His career became a monument not to honor but to manipulation, built on the idea that those below him existed to obey, not question. But corruption is not a stable foundation. It looks solid for years, until suddenly, without warning, it fractures, collapses, and exposes everything buried beneath. The downfall does not come because power runs out. It comes because truth finally becomes louder than intimidation. Abuse of power rarely appears overnight. It begins subtly. A favor, a cover-up, a file that disappears, a call made to the right friend at the right hour. And each step that goes unchallenged emboldens the next. Mancuso's office became the center of a silent network, not because people admired him, but because they feared him. Officers who wanted to speak stayed quiet. Witnesses withdrew, and junior staff learned that justice was negotiable. He trained his team, not in law, but in obedience. Yet power built on fear is like a window with cracks. It looks strong until pressure exposes every line of weakness. The chief believed that decades of control had made him untouchable, but in truth, those decades have been collecting evidence, enemies, and resentment that would one day converge in a courtroom. When a leader forgets that the badge represents service rather than domination, the system eventually responds. It may take time. It may require patience and secret recordings and months of monitoring. But accountability is slow only because it must be precise. Mancuso had convinced himself that threats could silence judges, that dismissing subpoenas could erase crimes, that calling in favors could unwrite consequences. But the flaw in such arrogance is that it forgets one fundamental reality. The law does not negotiate with ego. Abuse of power does not merely violate statutes. It corrupts morale, breaks institutions from the inside, and teaches good officers that integrity comes second to survival. The moment of downfall is rarely loud in the beginning. It starts with whispers, small investigations, unusual questions, files being re-examined, names resurfacing, patterns re-emerging. The same officers who once saluted him began to recognize that loyalty to him meant betrayal to justice. And once fear loosens its grip, truth has space to speak. Mancuso never understood that true authority is not maintained by intimidation, but by trust. When that trust evaporates, even decades of rank cannot hold a collapsing reputation together. The arrest was not merely the end of a career. It was the end of a culture he had crafted. For years, the station operated like a kingdom, where his approval mattered more than ethics, and where silence was rewarded more than honesty. The moment federal agents stepped forward was also the moment every officer saw the real measure of power. Not the badge, not the office, not the title, but accountability. Abuse of power does not just fall. It unravels, exposing every concealed thread of dishonesty that held it together. Mancuso believed authority gave him immunity. Justice revealed it gave him responsibility. In that revelation, his downfall became not a tragedy, but a necessity for the system, for the citizens, and for the future leaders who must learn that true strength and power lies not in dominance, but in restraint and integrity. Integrity is a quiet force that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, and doesn't bend even when the world applies pressure from every side. Judge Caprio's stance in that courtroom was not dramatic in tone, but it was monumental in meaning. When a figure like Chief Mancuso stands before the bench, he doesn't come alone. He brings decades of influence, people indebted to him, secrets traded in hallways no one sees, and a confidence born not from innocence, but from having escaped consequences too many times. Yet Caprio did not look at him through the lens of power or reputation, but through the simple lens of right and wrong. That is what integrity does. It removes noise, privilege, intimidation, and titles, and examines only truth, where others might have hesitated, compromised, or allowed pressure to soften justice. Caprio remained anchored to principle, not personality. Integrity becomes truly visible only when it is tested. Anyone can claim honesty when choices are easy and stakes are low. But when a man with deep connections, political protection, and a legacy of intimidation enters a courtroom, integrity is no longer a word. It becomes a choice made in the glare of consequence. Caprio knew that denying Mancuso leniency would not simply upset a man. It would disrupt a network. It could provoke backlash, threats, investigations into his own decisions. Yet he chose the path that leaders rarely take when pressured by power. He chose neutrality, fairness, and complete transparency. He treated Mancuso not as a chief, not as someone who had shared dinners with senators or traded favors with governors, but as a man answerable to the law. That simplicity is the highest form of integrity. The presence of FBI agents, months of hidden surveillance, and whisper reports brought into daylight were not just tools of justice. They were acknowledgments that Caprio's reputation had earned trust beyond local authority. Agencies do not quietly embed themselves into courtrooms unless they believe the judge before them cannot be swayed. His bench became not only a seat of judgment, but a sanctuary where fairness could exist without interference. When integrity reaches that level, it becomes a shield for the entire system. Officers who had been silent, intimidated, and cornered by Mancuso's dominance finally saw a figure willing to stand where they could not. Caprio's refusal to be intimidated gave courage to those who had been quietly watching power distort justice for years. Integrity is also a mirror. It reflects not only the morality of the judge, but the nature of the accused. Mancuso had spent years believing that outcomes were negotiable, that courtrooms could be influenced, and that if laws became inconvenient, they could be bent. Yet in front of Caprio, he faced something unmovable. It wasn't the bench that humbled him. It was a realization that his power had finally met a force that did not care about his title. Because integrity is immune to intimidation, it cannot be bought, pressured, or reshaped by influence. It stands even when corruption has worn a path so deep that most people forget what fairness looks like. When justice prevailed that morning, it wasn't only Mancuso's career that ended. It was the illusion he had built, the belief that some people stand above judgment. Caprio restored truth that institutions must protect at all costs. Justice must not depend on who you are, but on what you've done. Integrity allowed him to see the man without the mask of authority, without the armor of his badge. In doing so, he restored faith not just in the legal system, but in the idea that morality, when upheld consistently and quietly, can outlast and outshine even the longest shadow of corruption. Justice, when executed honestly and fearlessly, has the power to restore not only order but faith. In a society where authority is often questioned and power easily corrupted, the courtroom becomes the last remaining place where the truth can still stand without fear of influence. When Chief Mancuso's corruption was exposed and justice finally reached him, the biggest transformation was not only his downfall, but the healing of trust that returned to the system. For years, citizens had silently accepted that power would always protect itself, that a badge could become a shield rather than a responsibility. People who walked into the police station didn't expect fairness. They expected politics, delays, shortcuts, and deals. But the moment the court chose integrity over intimidation, a shift began, and that shift is the essence of true justice. In every community, justice serves two purposes: to punish wrongdoing and to restore confidence. Without the latter, the former has no meaning. A corrupt official going to prison is not only a personal defeat, it is a public message. When Mancuso was led away in handcuffs, it was more than a headline or a verdict. It was a reminder that systems can be repaired, that law is not owned by the powerful, and that even those who misuse authority cannot escape consequence forever. This restoration of belief is what truly strengthens institutions. A judge does not simply weigh evidence. He protects the soul of justice, ensuring that people never stop believing in fairness. For the honest officers who had worked under Mancuso, his arrest was not just a punishment, but freedom. For years, they lived under pressure, knowing that their duty was being twisted from the inside. Some stayed silent out of fear, some out of survival, and some because they had no proof strong enough to fight him. When truth finally surfaced, they too were released from that long burden. Their badge, which had been overshadowed by corruption, regained honor. They could walk back into their precinct not as silent observers of abuse, but as true protectors of the law. Justice did not simply remove a man. It repaired the meaning of a uniform. For the public, trust is delicate. Once broken, it does not return easily. Citizens who had stopped filing complaints, who had begun to believe that influence always wins, now saw a different ending. They witnessed that calm perseverance in the courtroom was more powerful than threats whispered in alleys. They understood that justice is not loud, but steady. While Mancuso used fear and position to control outcomes, the judge used patience, facts, and unwavering law. That contrast is what reforms society. People do not learn from speeches. They learn from consequences. Justice restored trust because it was delivered without hesitation, without bargaining, without favoritism. It reminded everyone watching that law is not a personal tool. It does not bend for friendships, titles, or history. It remains neutral, even when the guilty sits in a seat that once commanded respect. In that moment, the system washed itself clean. Not entirely, not permanently, but undeniably. True justice is not about winning a case. It is about renewing the belief that fairness can survive in a world crowded with self-interest. The day Mancuso fell was the day the system stood again. The judge did not simply bring down a corrupt official. He gave the city its confidence back. And once trust is rekindled, society breathes easier, knowing that justice may be slow, but it never truly sleeps. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is a decision that truth matters more than comfort, more than status, and more than the risk of losing everything. When Judge Caprio stood against Mancuso, he was not challenging an ordinary man, but a figure who had spent years using power as a weapon. Mancuso was not just a police chief. He was a gatekeeper of fear, a silent ruler of the departmental culture, someone who believed that authority was equal to invincibility. People didn't oppose him not because they believed he was right, but because they feared that standing up meant losing their jobs, reputation, safety, or future. In such an atmosphere, courage becomes rare and silence becomes a currency of survival. Yet justice can never breathe in silence. It requires someone at some moment to speak in a voice that is unshakable even when the world trembles around it. Judge Caprio did what many in the system had wanted to do, but never dared. He confronted arrogance, intimidation, and entitlement with calm firmness. Mancuso's influence didn't come from wisdom or service, but from years of manipulation and control. He believed himself untouchable, and more dangerously, he convinced others of the same. That lie was broken the day someone refused to be moved by his threats or swayed by his connections. Courage is powerful not because it shouts, but because it refuses to bend. In the courtroom, Caprio didn't raise his voice or create drama. He simply refused to be smaller than justice. When he denied Mancuso special treatment, when he questioned every unethical action, he was not just ruling over a case, but dismantling a culture of fear. Those who serve under oppressive authority often learn to adapt, negotiate, compromise, and stay invisible. Many of the officers who worked under Mancuso were not corrupt themselves. They were trapped. Some had families to protect, bills to pay, promises to keep. They had long accepted that survival meant agreeing with the man in charge, no matter how unjust his decisions were. But courage, even when displayed by just one individual, has a ripple effect. It gives others permission to breathe differently. It allows honesty to step out of hiding. When Caprio stood firm, the officers watching realized that courage is contagious. The walls of intimidation began to crack because someone finally showed that they could. Standing up to bullies is never comfortable because bullies do not operate with fairness. They know how to threaten without words, how to punish without open action, how to silence without noise. Mancuso had mastered this, but Caprio understood something even deeper. A bully's strength survives only when people believe in it. Once someone refuses to submit, the illusion begins to dissolve. Caprio's courage did not humiliate Mancuso. It revealed him. It showed the city, the department, and the legal system that power without integrity collapses under its own weight. True courage shapes society because it demonstrates that justice is not passive. It is active, deliberate, and sometimes costly. Caprio risked reputation, connections, and comfort, yet he chose principle over fear. That choice became a turning point not only for the case, but for everyone who had lived in Mancuso's shadow. Justice is not maintained by rules alone, but by the bravery of individuals who refuse to let those rules be bent. A system becomes strong not when it avoids conflict, but when it confronts the powerful with the same severity as it does the ordinary. The day Mancuso's control shattered was not just a victory in law, but a triumph of moral courage. One man's resolve against intimidation redefined strength. It proved that true authority lies not in the badge, the title, or the threat, but in the ability to stand unwavering in the face of someone who expected everyone to bow.